Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending. My name is Frank Bergoglio. I'm the Federal CTO here at Sailpoint, and it's my pleasure to have you join the session this morning. We're going to talk about reducing cloud vulnerabilities with identity and access controls. We're going to hit a lot of key areas. This is not a product brief, just to catch that up front. We're going to talk about the challenges, the drivers, the vulnerabilities and risk that we're experiencing with the identity, mainly around managing access. We're going to take a deeper look at using attributes for things like separation of duties and least privileges. We're going to talk about the identity security model and the fact that it is a team sport and there's a lot of pieces that make up this model. And then we're going to hopefully have enough time at the end to talk about a little bit about the strategy of how we get there. So without that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for joining. Guess I got to get closer to the mic a little bit. As we're going through this, if there's any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm happy to answer them. Please, those guys over there, don't be trouble and take me down a rat hole. But we're going to start talking about really what is the driver, right? And the drivers that we're seeing are the ones that really pop to mind are the digital transformation, IT modernization that we've already been going through for a number of years, and the transition as we move towards the cloud. And then, as most of it, the scab is still relatively new and hanging on, the remote workforce due to COVID. This presented us with a lot of challenges and complexities. And really what that meant was, increasing cybersecurity risk. And what we were seeing and what we've seen is that this move to the cloud lends itself towards misconfiguration, overexposed resources, really within any application that we're talking about. So this conversation you can take to heart for your AWS or your Google Cloud, your Azure infrastructure, and really any application, especially as we talk about modern security architecture, zero trust, which is getting more dynamic and attribute and contextually based. And that's really some of the things that we're going to try and point out here. But this risk that we're seeing, obviously, is really a lack of understanding of who is on the network, what access they have, and for our federal civilian agencies, some of that is captured with the CDM master user record, right? That was the whole purpose of building that user record. But really, when we think of these risky things that lead us down this path, beyond the lack of visibility, it's the lack of automation to change access when something about a user changes. The identity security ecosystem is all about that dynamic change, not just at runtime. The inconsistent management and controls of how access is granted. Your cloud infrastructure should be no different than your on-premise infrastructure. Your mission-critical applications require scrutiny just like your non-mission critical applications. So we need to have this, in order to have this complete view of risk, we need complete view of all the applications a user might have access to. But all of this creates an opportunity for stale, toxic combinations of access. And we'll talk a little bit about, the mythical shadow admin, right? The guy that's not an admin that is really an admin, right? And we'll talk about him in a second. And then the other risk is when an event occurs, there's so many different sensors and dashboards that we're dealing with. How do we visualize those, right? And these are the things that identity as the center and the foundation of your ecosystem can give you that visibility and that picture of risk. So what's being done about it, obviously there's that buzzword zero trust, right? And I don't like talking a lot about zero trust because I'm an old identity guy, and identity's been talking about least privilege for a long time. It's just the implementation of how it's changed. But reality is we're getting to this new model of access, new ideas of provisioning, new ideas and models of credentialing, and those things all impact our security model. But we can't get to the desired access model without controlling the identity in the beginning. So, identity is a huge part of the zero trust model, but I'm not saying it's the only thing. Don't get me wrong. Sailpoint and some of our vendors here, Radiant Logic, Ping, a number of the folks that are in this room are all part of the NCCOE Zero Trust implementation project for Zero Trust. And we're proving out these use cases, and imagine that they started out with identity, when we started building the NCCOE architecture. So why wouldn't an agency start out with that? And the other thing that's really, before we go too far, the master user record in the Department of Defense and in the federal civilian agencies is giving context to identities in a single place that most have not had in the past. So we can make these contextual suitability determinations of access before runtime. In my humble opinion, if we're waiting till runtime to detect an anomaly, we've waited too long. So we have to have that at least foundational sense that we are secure, risky, or risk averse, and we're handling some of these things before we're getting to the runtime authorization. So, the number of breaches, the number of results from surveys, all are 94% of identity or breaches are identity related. 97% of practitioners think we should be doing identity first. The information's there. It's not just market buzz anymore. I again, as a 26-year federal identity veteran, the identity's never been so important in federal government, and it's never got this much attention. Even when we were doing, HSPD 12, 15, 16 years ago, identity now has much more traction, and we have a bigger seat at the cybersecurity table, and that is what makes these conferences great. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities and risk, right? We talked a little bit about them now, but what really is the problem is that the problem's getting too hard for the human to manage with their own eyes. So you're seeing from a lot of vendors, artificial intelligence, machine learning being built into the analytics, into identity platforms, and this is allowing us to process and crunch through much more larger data sets to look broader across peer groups, to look broader across access anomalies before they occur. And all these things are key. When we consider this, this is actually a access policy out of the AWS implementation guide or tutorial. That looks like gobbledygook to me. That's not real human readable. I could probably discern what that might mean, but I have no resultant set of that policy. And that's exactly what my point is here, is the problem's getting too hard for the human to understand and manage. And when we're using access policies, and we have thousands of these policies, it makes it not much different than doing role-based access management. We still have to understand what that policy affects, who that policy lets in. The one thing that all of that, we can understand that, but we have no governance over that policy. So that's where the identity governance and identity security layer can come in and put a policy around that and take that policy and compare it to another policy and look for those overexposed resources, maybe toxic combinations of access, least privileged users, all those things that we're getting hit at in financial audits, in FISMA audits, all of these things are identifying the identity is extremely important, and it's getting too hard for the human to handle. Identity security, as I said, it's becoming the foundation. It always has been a foundation. It's the who, what, when, where, how of all access, right? And as I said, using the attribute layer as that first layer of defense to build the contextual identity profile, and then to use that data in your access control decisions. It gives you the who, the what is the entitlement, the when is the time of day that it can be used. So if someone tries to use it outside of normal hours, then we know that's an anomaly. So we're creating that baseline of what access should look like. So when we extend the identity ecosystem into the security ecosystem and tie it with things like behavior analytics and other tools, insider threat tools, we can start building this better picture and better posture. This is hard though, and it's very similar to a story from Greek mythology. I think the guy's name was Prometheus. John, you know the name. Prometheus, is that his name? I use the example, I don't remember the guy's name. So it's a story from Greek mythology that, this poor guy rolled this boulder up a hill every day. He'd get it to the top, he'd struggle, and then all of a sudden the boulder would roll back down the hill. Sounds a lot like role management to me. We've all been there, right? And role management can be a royal pain. We all know that. The human, it's hard to manage. And that's where, I mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning a little bit earlier. That's where that problem is being solved most. To being able to take the complexity of what roles look like, what application entitlement disbursement looks like, maybe geographically, either via location, areas of operation, might be job titles, might be employee types, but being able to do that peer group analysis is critical. And then being able to flip a switch, press a button and say, let's model that access and let's clean this up. It takes that human element out of it. And then being able to use that same contextual data through access recommendations and things like that becomes critical. So this poor guy, is very resemblant probably to a lot of us in this room that have ever done a role management project. So we're going to talk a little bit about the areas that are most painful, right? And to me, it's least privilege separation of duties. And as identity practitioners, we've been saying this for a long time. I mean, roles and identity and dynamic groups have been around since the beginning of time, whether you're in Radiant Logic, even in Active Directory. I'm an old Netscape directory guy from the 90s, and we even had dynamic groups. Dynamic groups, it's been the concept we've been using for dynamic access for quite some time. Those things aren't dead, right? But we need to have that data provenance or attribute provenance. As we're using this data to make these decisions, it needs to be accurate, it needs to be current, and it needs to be governed, it needs to be checked. We can't just rely on our authoritative sources all the time. Separation of duties is another one. It falls in line with least privilege, but separation of duties is one that can get us a lot, like that shadow admin that I mentioned a minute ago. That shadow admin is the guy that's been in the organization for a number of years. He's had several different jobs. He's not an administrator, or she's not an administrator, but their profile, because of their time within the organization, they've had super user access for one program they worked on. They had a different role in a different organization. They got other access. And when you look at all this access together, all of a sudden that person has more access than most of your administrators. And that leaves us critically vulnerable because we don't see that person on a report, and their current role may show up as something that they should have. So this is where identity, by giving you that picture of an identity over history, even comes into play more importantly. Hint number one, just-in-time access doesn't always solve this problem. It actually leaves this door wide open, and it's something where when we do just-in-time, we can do just-in-time with a governance layer underneath it. The end user doesn't know. The provisioning still occurs without the user knowing they were governed, but there may have been a policy check that ensured their suitability. There may have been a separation of duties check to make sure that the access was appropriate and not toxic. All happening behind the scenes, but governance just is key. And then there's, those folks that have a ton of access that don't use that access, and that access just becomes a risk. We're getting to this model where we want zero standing privileges. And as we move towards that model, it gets even more complicated. We need to make the access frictionless. So that request process that's doing that governance needs to be seamless to the end user, needs to be immediate, but with that governance layer inside of that request or inside of that assignment happening, we're ensuring that we're staying suitable and we're not over-provisioning users, creating those overexposed resources. Activity monitoring, before I go, is another one that is pretty critical. And I mentioned it a little bit more when we tie the identity ecosystem into the security ecosystem with SIM and SOAR. And this is really, one of those things where we see more and more of that tangential connections to identity governance or identity security. Whether it's, someone like Keyfactor, where we're bringing in machine identities into the picture, or we're, working with a PAM user where we're bringing privileged applications and privileged users into the identity governance, or just a mission critical system. Might be our cloud environment. It shouldn't matter. That's the point I'm making, is all these processes should go, all these accounts, entitlements, and everything should go through the same process. So we're maintaining that same posture and that same look for all access. Identity security answers some very easy questions. How do we provide, accurate and secure access in a timely manner? That really is where we're going with this. We want that access to be immediate, and that's what identity security gives you. It starts with the automation, whether that automation is, directly from a human resource system or from an authoritative data source or multiple authoritative data sources. It might come through a virtual directory. It might come direct into the governance process. We're bringing this data in, and we're creating that single picture so we can grant that day one access to get someone started on day one. And then as they move or leave the organization, their attributes, their data, their entitlements all changes with them. The governance that we provide in the identity security ecosystem through access modeling and profile management, SOD, suitability, that's really the access governance, right? That's how you get to that dynamic access model, is by having those things in place to understand what your access looks like, what it should look like for all different types of users and applications. It gives you the visibility and guardrails. So whether it's reporting or access certifications, recertifications, visibility, the analytics, these things that you can do with your identity data to enrich the rest of the security ecosystem is critical. But also to quickly be able to understand who are my critical risky users of mission system X. A lot of organizations can't tell you who their privileged users are within, an undesirable amount of time, 24, 48 hours or more. If we go way back a little bit to the OPM breach, it took them weeks to figure out who all the privileged users were. And that spawned a lot of the activity we're seeing today in privileged user administration across the government. And these things continue to occur. So foundationally, this is how we prevent that. And then, the efficiency, that's what identity security is really the main benefit, right? Whether you're doing access management through Okta or ForgeRock or whatever vendor you're coming through from, ultimately, we want to grant that access quickly and efficiently, but we want to have it governed and secure as well. And it should be data and policy driven. So again, that attribute provenance, that data provenance that we're using those attributes for this decision making, we need to make sure they're correct. Again, identity transcends heavily into the access management space. When we hear identity, a lot of us that have been around the federal identity ecosystem for quite some time, when we hear the word identity, we think PIV card. We think SSO. That's a very small piece of the puzzle. And, identity security is more than that authenticator or the credential. The credential is the end result. It's what you use to get through the door, right? The governance process of access. Governance is a term thrown around, which in the federal space means usually program or project controller management, right? When we say governance, we, Sailpoint specifically, in this space have always been challenged articulating the governance message to our customers because they confuse the definition. But the access governance is just the same. It's controlling the who, what, when, where, how of access through the identity controls. That gives us access that we know is in line with our least privileged desires, our separation of duty policies, our suitability policies, and things like that. Again, it's model-based access, right? And in this day and age, there's several models. Roles are not dead, as much as we would all like to end them. They're not dead. They're going to be around until there is a complete refresh of every software product that's on the market. Roles will be around for quite some time. Do they have to look like an Active Directory group that we provision and manage manually? Absolutely not. We look at roles, for example, within Sailpoint, they're dynamic, they're attribute driven. They are created based on other roles or other attributes. So these things don't have to be static that we have to manage and process and, have all of this additional overhead on. Roles can be things that are dynamic in nature, that are data-driven. They're just placeholders. Really, they can have no entitlement attached to them all. It can just be an attribute. So if we think of the RMF roles, if we were to bring those into an identity governance platform, that could be a role that's a contextual attribute about me. It could also have entitlements attached to it. It doesn't have to, though. That attribute for that RMF role could then be evaluated by, hey, remember that policy I put up here a little bit earlier? That access policy, that attribute could be evaluated in that access policy. So I had 0 standing privileges, I just had an attribute set. So my account in all essence, before it was scrutinized by those runtime controls, it smells like it has privileges, but it really doesn't until my device is checked, my location is checked, my context is checked, my attributes are compared against the access policy for the data tagging for the data that I just accessed. So roles I think aren't dead. I hate to, say that. I know some people will say, Frank, roles are dead. No, they're not. I'm sorry. I'll go to the grave with that one. That it's going to be a minute. Again, so it could be policy-based access. We see that a lot in Zero Trust. We've seen the ABAC model, the true ABAC model with executable start, come, leave, come back. It's not easy. So these things, when we're getting to this model-based access, and again, I'm going to say it, that attribute provenance, right? Those attributes that we're using in that decision-making process become critical. So now how do we get there? And that becomes, kind of interesting. And I came up with these questions. They're pretty standard, but, do you have full visibility into each identity and system in your organization? That's the first place to start, right? If you don't know who's using your system today, if you're not confident about how you've granted entitlements today, then you probably need to go back and look at your identity maturity model. Do folks get the access at the right time when they need it? If not, again, there's probably a workflow process. There's probably an onboarding process that needs to be evaluated so we can do this. Again, are these controls automated? How much of this is manual? In this day and age, all the vendors that are represented here today have automation. It's just natural. Some more than others, but that automation and automating these processes is critical. Whether we are replicating data through a virtual directory, whether we are provisioning through a unified directory, whether we are using a workflow engine in the governance platform, the automation is key. Things need to change when things about the user changes. Do we know what users are doing with their access? And that's another critical one, right? Identity is not going to tell you what people are doing with it, but it's going to lend you that way, right? That's where the behavior analytics come in. And the important thing when we start tying these things into that behavior analytics environment and we start looking at runtime usage of access, the PAM vendors are looking in session at what you're doing right then and there. And they can trigger if I'm a super user and I do something I'm not supposed to, any one of the PAM vendors can trigger that and say, Frank, you weren't supposed to do that. We're going to close your session down. So as they close that session down, though, what else should happen? My access should probably get disabled right away. If I did something I shouldn't have been doing, how do they know I'm not going to do something else? And that's when we tie into the access management vendors, we tie into the PAM vendors, having that simple link, usually over an open protocol like SCIM. We make that connection. It's a web service call these days. It's an API call to go disable that user. These things are very simple now in automation. And then, again, can you automatically terminate or modify access based on metadata? That's Identity Management 101. We brought them on that way. We should be able to get them out that way. And that's, again, going back to where just-in-time gets a little sketchy there, because just-in-time lets you right in the door, but then there's no thing to grab you back out of that when you no longer need that access. And that can be critical. Unless the access is temporal, and that's a whole other discussion, but not for here. And can you flag suspicious activity and alert appropriate administrators? Again, it might be risk-based, where we're looking, continuously monitoring and evaluating access before runtime. Speaking selfishly, Sailpoint, we're continuously running policies that are looking for SOD violations. We're continuously running policies that are looking for suitability determinations. These things then can be alerts, they can be flags, they can kick off processes. The idea is we're continuously alerting and looking at risk. Whether we're using risk scoring or just peer group analysis, the idea is that identity just doesn't get set and forget. It's something that needs to be continuously monitored to look for these suspicious activities. So tying into the Splunks and the Devos and the security ecosystem, the Exabeams, ForcePoint, whatever it might be, bringing all this information and taking action on it. And then really looking at that risk based on the entitlements that I have or the access that I have. And raising that risk score, raising that alert based on what I have or what you know about me. Always, I like to wrap these things up talking about identity strategy a little bit. How does one get started? And really, it doesn't matter where you're at in the maturity model. Understanding your assets and your risk assessment. These align very well with the NIST cybersecurity framework. Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Say that fast. And when we look at how identity applies, it really applies very well. It applies to all 5 families and over 100 NIST controls if we really want to get detailed. But understanding the assets and the risk assessment, absolutely critical. Most importantly, though, the understanding of your identity DNA. Are we talking about contractors? Are we talking about alumni or veterans? Are we talking about employees? Are we talking about constituents, service accounts, robotic processes, machines? We have to understand the types of identities that we're dealing with, the attributes that we know about them, that we can get about them. We don't need to have access to all of it. We just need access to them at some point, possibly. Then we build our governance model, right? And that really, the govern is starting with the identity layer and that authoritative data. Then we can go into the control phase where we're building the access controls, looking at our compliance impact, whether they're 853 controls, DSCID controls for SOD, whatever those controls are, we model those in and take into account our assets, our identities, our attributes, how we're going to build that model, right? So we're building that access model. We're automating through implementation. And then the integration piece, right? There's many other security components. There's access management, there's credential management, privilege management. There's directory services and meta directories we need to consider. There's SIM, SOAR tools, behavior analytics, insider threat. All these different tools then become part of the security ecosystem. We need to think about that ahead of time, but absolutely, it needs to be part of the process. And then most importantly is the maintenance and the continuous evaluation through automation, like I said, and then also through administrative oversight. And some of that should just be someone receiving a report or an alert, might be a SOC analyst receiving a trigger, might be the SOC analyst looking up data in the identity governance system or in the identity security ecosystem, to then take action. Most SOC analysts get an alert on their dashboard, they start investigating it, they see a user ID or an EDI-PI and they have no idea who that person is or any context about them. And that's where the identity ecosystem feeds back that data to the SOC analyst and he goes, oh yeah, John Ryan should have access to this. Well, we probably shouldn't give John access to anything, but it's a very easy way to give that SOC analyst the context they need to make that decision. And with that, I'm going to close it down and ask questions, answers. It's up for you. 5 minutes. I did it perfect. Yes, Andy. Absolutely.
Are there cloud-specific problems you're seeing, Azure, AWS, OIC, whatever, specific that you're?
Yes, so the first part of the question, absolutely. This not only applies to cloud or on-prem, this applies to all types of applications as well. But to answer your question, specifically for the cloud, what we're seeing is, especially in the government, if I was one of our commercial guys standing up here, they would be talking about the same group being responsible for cloud infrastructure and security, right? Or cloud infrastructure and identity. Smaller groups working closer together. The government's spread out a little bit. I've yet to talk to an identity team that also manages the cloud identities and the cloud infrastructure and grants privileges to it. Now that gets a little challenging. So when those guys are off building their AWS, Google, Azure infrastructures, they start scratching their head and saying, what sources should we get data from? How do we build this access model? If the ICAM offices said, here's the platform, here's the connection, here's how you govern it ahead of time, makes life very easy. We just had this conversation with a DoD customer that said, hey, I'm getting this new cloud environment handed to me, and one guy's got access to it, and he's got to start building out the access. That's a tough ask when you really start thinking about all those things I mentioned on that previous slide. You have to go through for that new environment. What are my assets in that environment that I need to protect? What are the entitlements? What are the policies? All these things come to mind, and when they're done separate outside of that identity governance ecosystem, they get done one-off again. And we're just creating, my fear of cloud directories and everything is, are we recreating the wheel that we've been trying to remove? Is all those separated, isolated, identity repositories, where the dynamic access model that Azure, Google, AWS implements is great for federation and things like that. But again, that's the challenge of what do those access policies really mean, and who's checking to see they're current. If we look at, I use Capital One. I probably shouldn't because they've had enough pain over the years for their breach. But really, it was misconfigured cloud infrastructure. And if there was governance, if there was visibility into the effect of controls and the access, that data may not have been leaked. But that is like the textbook example of misconfiguration in cloud environments that creates a huge vulnerability. There was an NSA report about 2 or 3 years ago, probably 3 years ago now, that talked a lot about the top 4 cloud vulnerabilities, and one of them was misconfiguration, the other one was patching, and just general maintenance, and then access controls, believe it or not, was another one, then supply chain, I think, was the other one. But those are all critical if you think about it, and a lot of them are addressed by identity. It's just getting the identity conversation into the right place with those that are deploying the cloud environments. But if it's a SaaS application, that should be no different than you're handling, your on-prem, whatever application, database, whatever it might be, right? Any other questions? Nope. Well, I think that's it. We're at time. I'll be around for a few minutes. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending. Really appreciate it.